Jon Snow stood atop the ramparts of Castle Black, the chill of the northern wind cutting through his furs. The wall loomed behind him like a silent sentinel, its icy face reflecting the last dim glow of twilight. His breath misted on the air as he looked out over the endless horizon of ice and snow, lost in a haze of lingering regrets. It was long after the war with the Night King, long after the Unsullied had sailed from King's Landing, and long after the new king had been crowned. He found no comfort in the new order. Jon had always been a reluctant leader, burdened by duty and haunted by the ghosts of those who had fallen under his watch. He rested a gloved hand on the cold stone of the battlement. Night pressed in around him, star-littered and silent, so different from the nights of war he remembered. From deep within the keep, he heard the occasional clamor of the watch, footsteps echoing in torchlit corridors, the jingle of mail, the barked orders of newly conscripted men sworn to the night's watch. They were green, these new recruits, replacing the many who had perished or deserted. But it was not truly his concern anymore. He was no longer Lord Commander. He was an exile, a living penance for crimes he still wasn't sure he had truly committed. Yet he remained here at the wall, where old oaths and old sins coalesced into a singular sense of grim purpose. At times, he imagined that the wind whispered names: Ygritte, Daenerys, Ghost, Arya, Sansa de Saunter. He saw them in flickering torches, heard them in the swirl of the howling gale. Ghost had gone with him, of course, but the direwolf roamed the wild tundra beyond the wall as much as he could. For all his heartache, Jon hadn't the strength to cling to even that final companion all day. He lifted his eyes to the heavens, where the moon hung pale and pregnant with silver light. There, a shape cut across its surface, a silhouette, enormous wings beating slowly, a reptilian tail curling through the sky. He blinked once, twice. The shape vanished. A trick of the light, he told himself, or perhaps simply the wild illusions of a weary mind. He turned from the ramparts and made his way down the winding staircase. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped into the courtyard. A few of his brothers nodded in silent greeting. As far as they were concerned, Jon was no threat, no savior. He was simply a man overshadowed by legends. Some said he was once king in the north. Others whispered that he was a secret Targaryen, but in these halls, such talk had grown stale. The truth was that it scarcely mattered now. He was here, a black-clad penitent with no kingdom, no queen, and seemingly no purpose. He walked to the mess hall, found a seat in a corner. The benches were a rough line of weathered wood. The flicker of candlelight revealed the ragged edges where new lumber had been crudely attached to broken seats. There were fewer men than once there had been, and the hush of a sullen evening meal settled over them. Stew slopped into wooden bowls. A couple of recruits elbowed each other, glancing at Jon as though uncertain if they should approach. Jon said nothing. He spooned half-heartedly at the stew, a tasteless mush of onions and thin meat. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying a strange rumble that reverberated through the stones of the castle. He froze with the spoon halfway to his lips. The rumble grew, a distant roar, akin to thunder, but thunder did not repeat in such a measured, pulsating cadence. He set his spoon aside and stood, ignoring the curious stares of the other black brothers. With sure, rapid strides, Jon left the mess hall. The moment he stepped into the courtyard, the roar sounded again, this time distinctly above him. He raised his eyes, and then he saw it. A shadow soared against the night sky, vast and impossible, greater in wingspan than any living creature should be. He felt his heart pound. He had seen dragons before, flown on one. He knew Rhaegal, and he had seen Drogon's might with his own eyes. This silhouette, though, was colossal beyond even that. For the blink of an eye, he felt unmoored from reality. The shadow passed over the moon, blacking out its glow. Then, in a breath, it was gone. The courtyard fell silent, every man frozen with fear or awe or both. Jon hurried to the main gate, heart throbbing a wild beat. The watchers on the ramparts were shouting. Some pointed east, others west, uncertain where the beast had flown. The men exchanged panicked, half-coherent remarks. "A dragon! one cried. "The biggest I've ever seen." Could the dragons have returned? "Is this Daenerys' beast?" Another man, older and wise, barked that it couldn't be Drogon. Drogon was big, the man said. But not that big. And he was right. This new presence was something out of the stories of the conquest, reminiscent of the tales of Balerion the Black Dread. Massive and ancient. A shadow of nightmares. Jon stood there, gaze scanning the skies. His pulse thudded, memories flooding him. He recalled Daenerys' face as she soared beside him on her own dragon, that sense of wonder, terror, hope, and closeness. Could Drogon have grown beyond all reason? Could another dragon have appeared? Some new spawn of old bloodlines? The possibility spun in his mind. That night, the dragon did not return. The Night's Watch scrambled to tighten defenses, to post extra men. Though what could a few archers do against such a monster, if it truly chose to attack? Jon returned to his chamber well past midnight. He lit a candle, the flame dancing on the rough stone walls. He tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, the roar echoed in his mind. Images of black scales gliding across an endless, snowy sky haunted him. He rolled over and stared at the flickering shadows on the wall, feeling as though something had shifted irrevocably in the tapestry of fate. The next day dawned bleak and cold, the skies iron gray with the promise of fresh snowfall. Jon rose early and left Ghost behind in the small corner of stable-like accommodations he had fashioned for the direwolf. The yard was already alive with anxious chatter. Men reported sightings of that monstrous silhouette in the early hours before dawn, drifting beyond the horizon. No attacks, no fires, only fleeting glimpses of a drifting giant. Rumors sprouted like weeds among the new recruits. Some insisting it was an omen of doom, others that it was the spirit of an ancient Targaryen come to haunt the living. Jon said little. He dressed warmly, saddled a horse, and left the castle behind. He needed to think, away from the suffocating speculation of the men. He rode across the snow-covered plains north of the wall, following old trails he had once known so well. Ghost soon appeared, a silent companion padding through the snow at his side. The sky remained bleak, pressing down like a laden quilt. Every so often, Jon would catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye, or a faint echo of that thunderous roar, but it might have only been the wind through the ridges of the hills. Hours passed, the light waning, and Jon found himself near an old abandoned wildling camp. The remains of wooden huts and campfires stood half buried in snow. As he dismounted and let his horse graze on the sparse patches of dried grass, Ghost pricked his ears. The direwolf stared east, hackles raised, but silent. Jon followed his gaze, hand drifting to the hilt of Longclaw at his hip. In the distance, partially concealed by the swelling curve of a snowy drift, something glinted black. He approached slowly, each step crunching. The closer he got, the clearer the shape became. A great shard of obsidian? No, that made no sense. It was black, yes, but scaled, ridged like bone. A half-buried chunk of something huge. With trembling hands, Jon cleared away some of the snow. His fingertips brushed a surface both cold and smooth, but with a leathery texture, as if it were a colossal eggshell. The realization made his blood pound. A dragon's egg, perhaps, but enormous in size, far larger than the eggs Daenerys had once shown him. This thing was battered, broken open from within. He felt a jolt of awe and dread. For if this egg had hatched, then it had birthed a creature that dwarfed any living dragon known in the modern age. Ghost sniffed around the fractured shell, his body tense. Jon turned his gaze outward to the horizon. The faint swirl of white wind whipped across the desolate landscape. Somewhere out there, that massive beast roamed. The very idea of it stirred a blend of wonder and foreboding. He brought only a piece of the shell back with him, carefully wrapped in cloth, tucked under his saddle. The question burned in his mind. How had this egg come to be in the far north? And was this the same creature that soared above Castle Black last night? Logic pointed to yes, but the implications were enormous. He remembered old stories of Balerion the Black Dread. the largest dragon ever to grace the skies of Westeros. The beast that helped Aegon conquer the realm. Balerion had died ages ago, or so the history said. Could this be some strange reincarnation? A direct descendant carrying the essence of the Black Dread? When he returned to Castle Black, he showed the shell fragment to the few men he trusted. Their faces paled, and none could offer a rational explanation. Over the next few days, sightings of the gigantic black dragon increased. Recruits reported seeing it circling miles away in the northern wastes. Some said they saw it land among ancient ruins of the Free Folk. Fear spread. Whispers of black dread ran through the corridors, accompanied by the memory of Targaryen might. Jon wrestled with uncertainty. Part of him felt a pull toward this creature, an inexplicable draw, as though it were calling him in the lonely night. Another part warned him that he had no claim to it, no right, and no reason to risk confronting a beast that could devour entire battalions if it so chose. Nevertheless, his mind circled back to the moment he had ridden Rhaegal. He could still recall that electrifying connection, the sense of attunement with a living, fire-breathing legend. Perhaps the Targaryen blood that ran in his veins, unasked for though it was, would give him a chance at approaching this new monstrous dragon. He tried to dismiss the thought, yet it grew each passing day, as if fate itself were nudging him closer to some inexorable destiny. Finally, late on a dim afternoon, when the sun hung low like an ember behind thick clouds, Jon resolved to ride out alone. He left Ghost behind this time, not wanting to risk the direwolf's life if it came to a confrontation. With the shell fragment as evidence, he ventured northward again, further even than the site of the old wildling camp. The landscape was a barren, wind-swept waste. Hills rose and fell, dotted with jagged rocks and outcroppings of ice. He pushed onward, numb fingers gripping the reins of his horse. Dusk fell, and the air grew bitterly cold. He made camp in a small hollow, lighting a modest fire with what kindling he had managed to carry. The horse stamped nervously, ears flicking. Jon fed the animal a few oats and patted its flank, whispering reassurance. Then he settled on a flat rock near the fire, cloak drawn tight, eyes scanning the horizon. The silence of the north pressed upon him. The hours stretched, his mind drifting to ghosts of the past. He thought of Daenerys' fierce determination and tragic end, of how he had betrayed her for the good of the realm. Or so he told himself. A roar shattered the stillness. Jon's heart leapt to his throat. Far above, hidden among ragged clouds, the monstrous shape emerged, a black silhouette drifting lower. Snow flurried in swirls as the great beast descended. He saw two eyes glimmer in the meager glow of the moon, like twin embers. The fire beside Jon hissed, as if cowering from the beast's approach. This dragon was larger than anything he had ever imagined. It landed with a heavy thud on a small ridge a few hundred yards away, the impact shaking the ground beneath Jon's feet. Massive wings folded, revealing sinuous flanks lined with black scales. Spines rose along its back like a row of obsidian swords. Jon stood slowly, leaving his sword at his hip, but not drawing it. His breath fogged in rapid plumes. The dragon regarded him, its head tilting. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest, vibrating through the night air. He remembered the approach he had taken with Rhaegal in a distant land. He took a tentative step forward, hands lifted slightly, palms open. No sudden moves, no aggression. He whispered words he was certain the dragon could not understand, but it felt necessary to speak gently. "I'm not here to harm you," he breathed, voice barely above the wind. The dragon's enormous eye flicked to the movement of his hand. It sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, detecting scents unknown. Jon took another step. The creature opened its mouth in a silent snarl, revealing fangs the size of greatswords. Steam billowed from its throat, the intense heat meeting the cold air. He felt that primal fear coil in his gut. He was but a mortal man, overshadowed by living fury. Yet something about the moment felt almost predestined. He inched closer, step by step, never once breaking eye contact with the beast. He was near enough now to smell the faint sulfur of its hot breath, to see each scale reflecting the dull moonlight. The ground beneath him was scorched in places, as though the dragon's mere presence singed the snow. John slipped the shell fragment from his pouch, holding it out as if in silent offering. The dragon's gaze flickered to it, then back to John. It lowered its head, just a fraction, a gesture that might have been curiosity or a prelude to an attack. John remained steady, though his pulse thundered in his ears. A tremor seemed to run through the dragon's body, like a silent quake. Then, ever so slowly, it extended its neck. John could see the ridges of bone beneath the scales, the cords of muscle tensing. The dragon sniffed the fragment in his hand, the rush of its exhale nearly knocking John backward. For a moment, man and dragon were poised in the hush of the night, a tableau of sheer impossibility. The red glow of the beast's eyes was not mindless rage, John realized. There was an intelligence there, deep and fathomless. It recognized something in him, or perhaps it was simply an echo of the Targaryen lineage that bound them. He dared to lift his free hand and place it gently on the side of the dragon's snout. The scales were warm to the touch, heated from within by living fire. His breath caught in his throat. The dragon allowed the contact, though it growled low. John nearly stumbled, overwhelmed by an inexplicable surge of emotion. Memories cascaded. He saw Rhaegal, Viserion, Drogon, Daenerys face, the raging battles of the past. And then, beyond the swirl of recollections, something new took shape. A sense of kinship, of acceptance. He murmured words he couldn't fully remember. Old Targaryen phrases Daenerys had once whispered, incantations that had been her lullaby to the eggs. The dragon's growl tapered off. Its gaze bored into him, a monumental presence that promised both salvation and destruction. Snow fell quietly around them, settling on black scales, melting almost instantly. John swallowed against the dryness in his throat. For a long while, they simply stared at each other. The storm-laden clouds overhead parted slightly, revealing the moon, which bathed them both in silver light. Then, as if in answer, the dragon spread its wings in a majestic sweep. With slow caution, it shifted its bulk. John realized it was lowering a shoulder, presenting an angle not unlike an invitation. He hesitated. He had ridden Rhaegal, yes, but this creature was even more colossal, its power unfathomable. His entire body trembled, but he knew in his heart that if he balked now, the connection might be severed. He secured the shell fragment back into his pouch and moved closer to the dragon's flank. Careful, measured steps. One slip and he could find himself flung into the snow, or devoured in a single snap. The dragon made a low rumbling sound, not quite hostile. John wrapped his arms around a protruding spine and hoisted himself up, hooking a leg over the ridge of the beast's shoulder, where the scales formed a kind of natural saddle. He thought of the old tales of the Balerions who had forged saddles for their dragons. Here, he had no such device, only the faint memory of how to cling to a living storm. With a sudden lurch, the dragon rose on its hind legs. John fought to keep his balance, pressing his torso against the beast's neck. Then the wings snapped open, a thunderous crack that stung his ears, and they launched into the sky. The force pressed John downward, and for a moment he thought he would be hurled off into the void. But he held firm, gripping with all the strength in his arms and legs. Feeling the dragon's mighty heartbeat beneath him, the wind cut across his face, biting cold, exhilarating. They rose higher, passing through veils of cloud, the snow-swept landscape dropping away beneath them. John dared to open his eyes fully, peering over the dragon's shoulder at the endless expanse of the north. The wall was a white line in the distance, and beyond it, the scattered glint of frozen lakes, the broken shadow of ruined keeps. The sky was a deep cobalt, scattered with stars. He felt an echo of that old wonder. Not since he had flown beside Daenerys had he known such euphoria. Yet it was tinged with an underlying sorrow, as if the dragon's presence reminded him of all that had been lost. They circled high, the dragon's flight a testament to raw power. Each wing beat sent shockwaves through the air. John blinked away the tears forced from his eyes by the rushing wind. Far below, he thought he saw the glow of distant torches. Castle Black, perhaps, or some other outpost. But they soared beyond it, out over the true wilderness, where the wind sang across desolate plains. In time, the dragon angled its wings and descended. They touched down in a valley near the bones of a colossal fortress, ancient and broken. The walls were cracked, half buried in drifts. Large pillars jutted from the earth like the ribs of a long-dead beast. The dragon folded its wings, and John slid down its side, landing in knee-deep snow. He stumbled, breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold burning his lungs. By the time he found his footing, the dragon's head was lowered beside him, as though regarding a curious pet. John looked up. The name leapt unbidden to his thoughts. Balerion, he murmured. The old stories told of how Balerion had been known as the Black Dread, the greatest of all Targaryen dragons. From the size and raw majesty of this one, the name felt oddly fitting, and it caught in his throat with a sense of wonder. "Have you returned?" He felt foolish speaking aloud, but in the emptiness of the north, it was only him and the beast. The dragon snorted, a puff of hot breath ruffling John's hair. Carefully, John reached out and laid a hand on its snout again. This was not an accident. The choice to land here in these ruins carried an air of significance. He could almost sense the dragon's history, something stretching back through centuries of slumber or rebirth. An echo of ancient Valeria's darkest secrets. If this truly was Balerion reborn, or some spiritual successor bearing the same monstrous might, then what was it doing here, in the far northern wastes? Joan's gaze drifted over the broken walls. The architecture was strange, possibly older than the first man. Runes etched into the stone had been worn away by wind and ice. The hush of the place was absolute. Balerion let out a low rumble that sounded almost mournful. John felt a pang of empathy, an odd connection bridging the gulf between them. They were both relics in their own way. He the last scion of a shattered dynasty, the dragon a living myth out of time. Night stretched on. Though he feared the cold, John found an alcove of rubble sheltered from the wind. The dragon curled nearby, its body a living furnace of heat. So close that he felt the warmth radiating off its scales, John gathered some scraps of wood from broken beams and kindled a small fire. No gust of wind could reach them here, and Balerion's presence kept the temperature bearable, if only just. John ate some dried meat from his pack, offering a piece to the dragon as a gesture of goodwill, though Balerion merely sniffed and turned away, clearly craving something far more substantial than dried venison. John dared to rest. He felt safer here, within arm's reach of a behemoth that could incinerate entire armies, than he had in the halls of Castle Black. Sleep was fitful, filled with feverish dreams. He saw Daenerys again, bathed in blood and fire, whispering something about the Iron Throne. He saw the Hall of Kings in King's Landing, the Iron Throne melted down, half-twisted from dragonflame. Then he saw a new vision, a black dragon perched upon the Red Keep's highest parapet, roaring to a city below. He heard voices chanting a name, Targaryen. He jolted awake to find the dragon's colossal eye studying him. Dawn broke gray and meager, as it so often did in the north. John stirred from his meager camp and stood, brushing the snow from his cloak. He moved closer to Balerion, who rose with a stretch of sinuous limbs and a ripple of muscle. The dragon turned its massive head toward John. Another moment passed in that hush, an unspoken question in the morning light. John ran a hand through his hair, mind churning with possibilities. He could ride back to Castle Black and pretend none of this had happened. Yet the memory of that vision lingered, a silent drumbeat in his thoughts. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the dragon's neck. The beast snorted, then lowered its shoulder enough for John to climb once more. As his fingers found purchase on the ridges, a grim determination settled over him. There would be no ignoring this, no turning away from the monstrous destiny that might await him. He felt a latent fury pulsing within the dragon, an echo of flames older than the Seven Kingdoms themselves. And, inexplicably, it felt as though they were bound by some ancient design. They soared again, the wind slicing across Joan's cheeks. He guided with his knees, shifting his weight as he had learned in those few precious flights with Rhaegal. Balerion responded, albeit with raw, untamed force. The dragon's roar split the sky. Hours passed, the sun rising behind clouds, casting a weak glow across endless snow. The two of them glided over frozen rivers, the ragged peaks of ice-laden hills, and eventually the shimmering line of the wall itself. Jon caught his breath at the sight of Castle Black from above. The fortress looked tiny. Men scurried in the courtyard, pointing upward, panicked shouts drifting upward. Balerion circled, wings thundering. Jon felt a twinge of guilt for terrifying the watchman, but he also felt something akin to pride. No, not pride. An acknowledgement of what he had become. He was Targaryen by blood, a rider of dragons, whether he had wanted it or not. This, he realized, was the birthright he had never asked for. A birthright he had tried to deny until every path had led him here, clutching the spines of a beast that dwarfed even Drogon's might. He guided the dragon lower, though not close enough for arrow range. The Black brothers gaped openly, unsure whether to flee or fight. Their fear was palpable. Jon wanted to show them there was no malice. Slowly, he maneuvered Balerion into a wide arc, letting the watchers see him astride the monster, hoping they would recognize him. The dragon roared, the sound echoing across the ice. Arrows were nocked, bows trembling in the fists of novices. Jon willed them not to shoot. "Jon!" he heard someone shout. It was a muffled cry over the rush of wind. He couldn't quite identify the speaker. He raised a hand in a calming gesture. Someone else hollered, "Hold your fire." The men hesitated, glancing at one another. Balerion snorted, exhaling a plume of heated breath that shimmered in the cold. Perhaps out of sheer shock, none loosed an arrow. Jon lifted his hand in a gesture of peace. Then, satisfied that a massacre would not break out, he pulled gently at one of the spines to guide Balerion upward. The dragon understood. With a thunderous beat of wings, they climbed again, leaving Castle Black behind in swirling white. Jon could not remain in the north as if nothing had changed. Already rumors would flood the Seven Kingdoms, that a massive dragon roamed beyond the wall, that the bastard of Winterfell, once a king in the north, once a Targaryen by blood, rode upon its back. He wondered how the lords of Westeros would react to such news. Some might see it as a threat. Others might see it as an opportunity. And Jon, he felt only the weight of possibility pressing down upon him. He realized now what the dream had suggested. The dragon perched on the Red Keep, a city kneeling. The old prophecy that the dragon has 3 heads. The whisper of Targaryen restoration. He had never wanted the throne. Indeed, he had gone to great lengths to avoid it, even at the cost of heartbreak and exile. But power sometimes comes to those who least desire it, and here it was, in the form of the mightiest dragon ever to cross the skies. Afternoon found Jon and Balerion soaring south, beyond the snows, over forests frosted white at their edges, and eventually across the wide brown rivers that curved through the north. Jon scanned the ground for some place to land, to rest, to think. He chose an open plain near a half-ruined holdfast, deserted, from the look of it. The dragon alighted with a resounding crunch on the snow-covered earth, scattering a few crows that had been pecking at fallen seeds. No one emerged to challenge them. The place was truly empty, battered by winter storms. Jon dismounted. His legs felt weak, quivering from the strain of the ride. Balerion folded its wings, prowling the perimeter with curiosity. Broken walls, scattered stones. A single tower stood precariously. Jon found a stable area for them to shelter, though in truth, the dragon could shelter them both from almost anything but the worst blizzard. He made a small fire, methodically preparing to camp. As twilight settled, the wind picked up, moaning through the broken stones. Jon took stock of what little supplies he had left. He would need more if he meant to continue south. And the question loomed. Should he do it? Should he embark on a quest that might plunge Westeros into another round of fear and warfare? He thought of the chaos that would grip the realm if he arrived at Winterfell, or if he crossed the Neck, or especially if he soared over the Trident. Armies would march or cower. Lords would reforge alliances or break them in panic. But there was another possibility, a chance to rebuild, to unify. The Iron Throne had proven a cursed seat. Bran had taken it, though not truly in the Targaryen style. He ruled with a more detached, measured approach, some said. Jon had not seen his brother since the day of the sentencing. Would the realm accept a new Targaryen on a new black dragon, or would it recoil in terror? He rested his forehead against his hand. Duty, he thought. It had always been about duty. Once, that sense of duty forced him to kill the woman he loved. What would it ask of him now? Balerion growled softly as if sensing Jon's unrest. Jon stared into the dragon's ruby eyes, seeing there a reflection of his own turmoil. Maybe the gods had chosen him for something more. Some final balance to the story of ice and fire. The pull was undeniable now, a compulsion that had begun the moment he'd touched that shell fragment. Some intangible chord had been struck, an echo from Balerion times. Sleep came in fragments that night, punctuated by the dragon's occasional rumble and the wind's shriek through the stones. Each time Jon drifted off, he dreamed of standing in the throne room at the Red Keep, where melted swords twisted into a shape almost unrecognizable as the Iron Throne. In his dream, Balerion coiled behind him, the very walls trembling under its presence. A hush fell over the gathered lords and ladies. He felt the weight of thousands of eyes. And then, from among the throng, he saw the faces of his siblings. Bran's unreadable expression, Arya's quiet resolve, Sansa's practiced poise. Tyrion Lannister appeared too, mouth curved in a rueful half-smile. The dream parted like smoke, leaving only the faint sense of destiny in its wake. He woke to the hush of dawn. The sky, a pale silver behind a tangle of clouds. He stood, bones aching, and fed a few more sticks to the last flickers of the fire. Balerion stretched, the movement of its giant body resonating through the earth. There was no turning back, Jon realized. If he slunk away to live as a hermit in the far north, the dragon would either follow him or carve a path of its own. The realm would still be thrown into chaos by rumors and fear. The only way forward was to meet the challenge head-on, to harness this power for something greater than his own solitude. He gathered what little he had, mounted the dragon, and urged it into the sky once more. The land fell away, and he felt that familiar rush of wind and adrenaline. They soared southward, each wingbeat carrying them further from the cold truths of exile, and closer to a future he could barely envision. Over time, the white blanket of snow gave way to patches of frost, and then to brown fields lying fallow in winter's grip. Rivers cut gray lines through the landscape, occasionally frozen at the banks. Villages dotted the plains, smoke curling from chimneys. Jon wondered what the small folk would think when they looked up to see that monstrous shape crossing the sky. The day wore on. Once, he spotted a group of riders on the ground, distant specks galloping at the sight of the dragon overhead. Perhaps news would spread quickly. By raven, by rumor. Let them talk, Jon thought grimly. This time he would not hide. The gods had placed him here, an unwanted Targaryen with the largest dragon in the world, for reasons he could not fully fathom. But if war was to come, let it come. If peace was an option, he would strive for it. The fate of Westeros hung in the balance. By the time dusk approached, he glimpsed the outline of the riverlands in the distance, rolling hills, twisting rivers, wooded copse. He guided Balerion lower, searching for a secluded spot to rest. The dragon let out a low bellow, perhaps sensing prey nearby. A deer darted from a copse of trees, startled by the colossal presence above. With a terrifying grace, Balerion banked sharply and unleashed a jet of flame. The deer had no chance. The fire scorched the ground in a blinding flash. The acrid smell of burnt fur and the roar of flames filled the air. Jon grimaced, though he knew the dragon needed to eat. The smell of cooking flesh mingled with the crisp winter breeze. Balerion swooped down, plucked the charred carcass from the blackened earth, and devoured it in brutal gulps. Jon turned his eyes away. He had seen violence, had doled it out himself, but the raw ferocity of a dragon's kill was something else entirely. Night settled as they found a sheltered spot near a frozen stream. Balerion curled into a massive coil, while Jon slid down and paced along the water's edge. He tried to imagine the next steps. Winterfell was still leagues away. King's Landing was even farther. The realm had changed under Bran's rule, or so rumor had it. Some lords might welcome a Targaryen restoration, others would fiercely oppose it. The tension in his stomach coiled tighter as he thought of the wildfire that might erupt if the wrong sparks were thrown. He knelt by the edge of the frozen stream, glimpsing his reflection in the ice. His face appeared older than he remembered, lines of care marking his brow. He remembered the words, "You have to choose now. The realm or her." He had chosen the realm. But had that realm rewarded him? Had it truly found peace? Or had it merely traded one conflict for another? He pressed a fist against the ice. Somewhere far behind him, Balerion let out a soft rumble. Come morning, they would continue. John would cross the riverlands, perhaps paying discreet visits to smaller holds. He would gauge the local sentiment, gather supplies if he could, and decide whether to head first to Winterfell or continue onward to King's Landing. A voice in his heart told him he should see Winterfell again, see his siblings, if they would even allow him near. Another voice reminded him that time might be of the essence, that each day the rumor of a black dragon soared from lips to lips, carrying dread and fascination across the kingdom. As the pale moon rose, John found himself unable to sleep. Instead, he sat near Balerion's flank, lulled by the heat that radiated from the dragon's body. He traced his fingers along a scar in the scales, perhaps from a time before it had hatched, or from some mysterious battle in the wilds. His own scars tugged at his flesh, the old wounds from daggers and arrows, from a life spent fighting battles he never sought. He wondered if he was fated to fight yet another battle, this time for a throne he did not want. The gods seemed cruel, or perhaps they had a plan. The notion that he was no more than a pawn of destiny chafed at his sense of self, yet here he was, a Targaryen, riding the greatest dragon the world had known. The logic of it felt inexorable, a tide that pulled him forward, whether he kicked against it or not. Balerion, John whispered, testing the name again. The dragon's eyelids slid open, the pupil contracting at the dim glow of the moonlight. A curl of smoke drifted from its nostrils. The beast did not roar or growl, only stared at him. In that silent exchange, John felt a flicker of understanding pass between them. It was as though the dragon recognized him as more than a rider, recognized that shared thread of Targaryen fire woven through his blood. The night wore on, each hour stretching. At one point, John thought he heard the distant cry of a wolf. Maybe Ghost still roamed the wilds, searching for him. Perhaps the direwolf sensed his departure, left alone at Castle Black. The guilt pressed on John's chest. He wished he could have brought Ghost along, but that had seemed too dangerous at the time. Now, he felt the pang of loneliness. The direwolf had been with him through so many trials. Before he realized it, false dawn began to lighten the horizon. He stood slowly, every joint stiff from the cold. Balerion rose too, shaking off the dusting of snow. The dragon's eyes gleamed, its breath forming clouds of steam that glowed silver in the early light. John collected what little he had, swallowing a meager portion of dried rations. He approached Balerion carefully, sliding a hand along the powerful neck, feeling the cords of muscle tense beneath the warm scales. Then he climbed up, settling into place. A beat of wings, a roar that rippled the air, and they took to the skies once more. So began another day of flight, of crossing the wide expanse of the riverlands. John caught sight of a few villages from above, no grand cities, but clusters of huts and farmland dormant in winter. Sometimes, folk ran inside at the sight of the monstrous dragon. Other times he noticed them simply staring in disbelieving awe. Children pointing upward, parents gathering them close. He hoped none would try to shoot arrows. Perhaps they were too terrified or too stunned to provoke the beast in their sky. Late in the afternoon, he saw the red fork of the trident shining below, partially frozen along the banks. He guided Balerion toward a rocky outcrop near the water's edge, thinking to rest and let the dragon hunt again. They landed with a tremor, scattering a flock of crows. From a distance, John glimpsed a group of travelers on the road, wagons loaded with supplies, likely merchants braving the winter roads. They halted at the sight of the dragon, wheels creaking to a stop, horses neighing in terror. John dismounted, raising a hand in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. He saw movement among them. Several men brandishing spears, a woman pulling a child close. He called out, voice carrying over the wind, I mean you no harm." He doubted they could hear him well, but they appeared uncertain, not advancing nor fleeing. Balerion sniffed the air, growling low. Jon knew the dragon's presence alone was enough to chill the hearts of the bravest knights, let alone common merchants. Carefully he led Balerion a few paces away, letting the travelers see him do so. The dragon followed, its tail lashing slowly. After a tense moment, one man rode forward on horseback, keeping a wide berth. He seemed to be trembling, though he tried to keep a steady posture. Jon realized, with a pang, that he likely looked as fearsome as the worst tales of Targaryen conquerors. The man shouted, "Seven, save us! Who are you? And what is that monster?" Jon's voice felt rusty. "I am Jon Snow," he called, "rider of this dragon. We won't harm you." The man's expression twisted in confusion, maybe recognition. Jon knew his name still lingered in some corners of the realm, though overshadowed by rumors. "We need only a place to rest," Jon added, "and perhaps some supplies. I'll pay if I can." The man hesitated, glancing back at his companions. A woman called out, "That's a Targaryen name, that is." Others murmured anxiously, uncertain whether to flee or comply. Finally, the man waved for Jon to approach, though his white-knuckled grip on the reins betrayed his tension. Jon nodded and moved closer, leaving Balerion behind, the dragon's eyes following his every move. When Jon reached talking distance, the man swallowed visibly. "Jon Snow, you say? Weren't you the king in the north once, the one who killed the Mad Queen?" His voice quivered. Jon's jaw tightened at the mention of Daenerys. He offered a curt nod, feeling old wounds rip open. "I am," he said, "but that's done now. I only seek passage and peace. The dragon is with me. It won't attack you unless provoked. We mean no harm." "Nay." The man looked uncertain, but the woman with the child rode a bit closer, peering at Jon through wide, fearful eyes. She said nothing, only clutched her daughter to her chest. Jon saw the raw anxiety etched on her face. The men with spears still hovered at a distance. Jon gently raised his hands, palms outward, in a gesture of surrender. "We have some supplies," the man finally said, "though not much. It's been a hard winter." Jon dipped his head. "I understand. I can hunt, or the dragon can. We have coin if you need it, though not much. All I ask is a safe place to rest tonight. If you know somewhere close that won't raise alarm." The man shook his head slowly. "Nearest town is a few leagues off, and they'll be plenty alarmed, I'd wager, if you show up with that beast." His gaze flicked to Balerion, who snorted, sending a burst of steam into the air. "But there's an old watchtower near the fork of the river, half abandoned. No one's used it in a year. You might find shelter there for the night, though I can't promise you won't freeze." "That Nettie." Jon nodded his thanks, rummaging in his pouch and finding a few silver stags. He pressed them into the man's trembling hand. "For your kindness," Jon said. The man blinked in astonishment at the coins. "7 watch over us," he murmured, pocketing them. Then in a timid tone he asked, Are you come to claim the throne then? Another Targaryen war?" Jon's chest constricted. He glanced at Balerion, a living symbol of ancient conquest. Turning back to the man, he answered quietly, "I don't want war. The gods help me, I don't want it. But sometimes what we want and what the world needs are different things." With that, he took a step back, nodding a farewell. The travelers lingered, half in awe, half in dread, as he returned to the dragon's side. Balerion roared once, a sound that shook the trees. The travelers urged their horses forward, eager to put distance between themselves and the monstrous presence. Jon gazed after them, a hollow feeling coiling in his stomach. Word would spread. Whispers of a black dragon in the riverlands, with a Targaryen rider. He mounted Balerion, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts, and directed the beast toward the watchtower the man had mentioned. The immediate goal was shelter. The greater question, whether or not he should truly press on to claim a throne that had caused so much bloodshed, remained unanswered. They arrived at the watchtower before dusk fell completely. finding crumbling stone walls and a roof half caved in by storms. Balerion settled on the hillside, tail twitching irritably. John dismounted, sword clinking against stone. In the last glow of day, the land lay tranquil. But a tension electrified the air. He felt it in his bones, an omen of storms to come. He would rest tonight, gather what fortitude he could, and tomorrow, the journey would continue. With each wing beat south, the realm drew nearer, and so did the threat of upheaval. He was Jon Snow, reluctant Targaryen, and Balerion's rider, for better or worse. Come what may, winter had taught him to endure, and fire had taught him to rise from ashes. He could only hope that he would find a path between scorching conquest and the frigid burdens of his past. And so the long, perilous road to reclaiming what might once have been his birthright had begun, with the black dread reborn, bearing him onward into the uncertain dawn. Winke. John woke to the sound of wind sighing through gaps in the ancient stone, the echo of rustling debris drifting across the watchtower's ruined floors. A pale dawn lit the interior with a cold gray glow, revealing the scattered remains of old barrels, broken chairs, and half-buried piles of rubble. Snow had drifted in through collapsed portions of the ceiling, forming small white dunes in corners that had once been guarded walls. He lay stiff against the wall where he had slept, rolled in his cloak, a thin layer of frost crusting its edges. Outside, he could hear the faint rumbling breath of the dragon as it stirred. He pushed himself upright, massaging a sore shoulder. Each passing night in these makeshift camps reminded him of his body's limits. There was no comfort in this journey, only necessity. Yet it felt strangely fitting for a man who had spent his life in service of duty, haunted by regrets and burdens that never seemed to lighten. He shook the stiffness from his limbs, exhaling a visible plume of breath. The watchtower's interior was bitingly cold, but he sensed that the day would bring at least a marginal warmth compared to the far north. A faint glow peeked through a ragged gap in the wall, dust motes drifting in the soft morning light. He gathered his cloak around him and moved carefully, stepping over a splintered beam. He had left Balerion outside the previous evening, trusting the dragon's presence alone to ward off any threat. Indeed, if bandits or soldiers had crept near, they would have fled at the first roar. No one sensible would challenge such a beast. He slipped through the watchtower's broken doorframe, boots scraping on loose stones that tumbled down the short slope. A hazy dawn stretched across the riverlands. Strands of mist coiled above the frozen stream. Frost glimmered on every broken twig, every dead weed poking through the snow. And there, looming like a creature from some terrible dream, was Balerion. The dragon's colossal mass all but swallowed a portion of the hillside. Black scales glistened with hoarfrost, and the heat that pulsed from its body made the surrounding air shimmer. As John approached, the dragon rumbled low in its throat, a greeting more than a threat. John placed a hand against Balerion's flank, feeling the warmth that radiated through the scales. He let a moment pass, listening to the dragon's slow breathing and the soft crackle of the frosted grass underfoot. As he moved alongside the creature's long neck, he reached to scratch beneath a ridge of scales, the way he'd once seen Daenerys soothe Drogon. Balerion made a deeper noise, a vibration that resonated like distant thunder. John took it as a sign the creature found some measure of comfort in his touch. His provisions were dwindling faster than he liked. He had enough to stave off hunger for a day or two, perhaps, but then he would need to secure more food. The dragon, on the other hand, would find its own meals. Deer, boar, or even the occasional fish from rivers. But John was not so fortunate. He still had to rely on mortal means to fill his belly. Hunting was an option, but he had neither the time nor the skill to keep himself well fed in the wild while traveling at this pace. There was no choice but to find some place where the folk might offer him supplies, perhaps for coin, or perhaps out of fear. He disliked the idea of using the dragon as intimidation, yet knew it might be the only coin some people would heed. He thought about the conversation with the merchants the day before. They had been terrified but not hostile. That encounter had chipped away at his illusions. He wouldn't be able to pass through unnoticed in any manner. Already, ravens would be flying, tongues wagging. By now, lords and commoners alike might know that a monstrous black dragon, and a rider calling himself Jon Snow or Targaryen moved south. He wondered how far the news would spread and how quickly. He also wondered what his siblings were doing at Winterfell. Did Sansa even want him to return? Did Arya, if she still roamed the world, think of him at all? And Bran, the king on the Iron Throne, what might he do at the rumor of his exiled brother approaching on the back of the greatest dragon alive? Jon had no answers. Yet the need to reach them, or to reach someone who could help him navigate this new destiny, felt urgent. After a last moment of reflection, he set about searching the watchtower grounds for anything useful. Among the rubble, he found an old bucket with a cracked bottom, some tattered rags, and scraps of rotting wood. No food, no real supplies. He kicked at a half-buried metal container, heard only the echo of emptiness. A mouse scurried out and darted away, vanishing into the debris. With a sigh, Jon looped his cloak more firmly around his shoulders and moved back to Balerion. "Time to go," he murmured, though the dragon needed no prompting. It seemed restless, black eyes gleaming with primal energy. Jon adjusted the worn gloves on his hands, rubbed at the patchy stubble on his face, and grabbed hold of the dragon's shoulder spines. With a grunt, he hauled himself up, climbing until he was astride the broad back, the ridges offering a precarious seat. Balerion flexed its wings with a sound like snapping sails, scattering a dusting of snow and frost. Jon braced himself, heart pounding in anticipation of the dizzying ascent. Without further warning, the dragon launched off the ground. The rush of motion was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Icy air whipped at Jon's face, and he clung fiercely to the scaly spines, teeth chattering at the sudden onslaught of wind. They rose swiftly, passing over the watchtower's crumbling top. He cast a final glance down at the lonely ruin, then turned his gaze forward. The countryside stretched before him in winter's muted palette. Over the rolling hills, a faint white haze drifted from scattered homesteads, where simple folk must be huddling around fires, unaware or only dimly aware of the legendary beast soaring overhead. Jon directed Balerion south by subtle shifts in his weight, recalling how Daenerys had taught him to guide a dragon's flight. The great beast responded, albeit with an occasional show of stubborn will. More than once, Balerion veered sharply, chasing some ephemeral prey or investigating a new smell. Jon's heart lurched each time the dragon swooped unexpectedly, but he gradually found a rhythm, an unspoken language between them. The trust was fragile, but growing. Hours passed in flight. He saw the wide waters of the Red Fork below, chunks of ice floating on the current. The land was dotted with small hamlets. Some had meager farmland, others boasted only a handful of huts. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, wavering columns that vanished into the steel-gray sky. As midday approached, the sun pierced the cloud layer occasionally, throwing sudden beams of light on the frosted plains. The brilliance reflected off the water, dazzling Jon's eyes. Hunger gnawed at him. His last meal had been scant, and the cold sapped his energy more quickly than he liked to admit. He contemplated landing near a settlement, but the memory of the merchant's fear gave him pause. Arriving astride a monstrous dragon would cause panic. The small folk might flee or bar their doors, leaving him with no chance to negotiate for supplies. Alternatively, some hot-headed militia might attempt to repel him, though likely to their doom. Neither option appealed to Jon, yet he couldn't simply starve. He considered a less direct approach. Perhaps he could land Balerion out of sight, in a secluded clearing, and walk to a village on foot. Even so, it was a risk. He reminded himself that word was spreading. It might be too late to walk in quietly. Some keen-eyed lookout or traveler might see him dismount and realize who he was. But he had little choice. A man needed food. At length, he spotted a large wooded area near a bend in the river, thick enough to conceal Balerion's bulk, if not perfectly, then at least somewhat. Pines and oaks, leafless but numerous, grew in dense clusters. He leaned forward, urging the dragon to descend. Balerion grunted but complied, spiraling lower in a broad circle. The wind whistled through the bare branches as they approached. Jon's pulse quickened. Finding a suitable clearing might be challenging given the dragon's size. They passed over the forest canopy, branches swaying beneath the gusts from Balerion's wings. The dragon spotted a gap in the trees and dove. John's stomach lurched at the sudden drop. Needles of pine scraped at the dragon's flank. A loud crack resounded as an unfortunate trunk gave way under the beast's weight. Balerion half landed, half crashed, sending birds shrieking skyward. Snow cascaded from the boughs, and the earth trembled under those massive claws. When the dust settled, they were in a small clearing ringed by tall pines. Broken branches littered the ground. John exhaled shakily, relieved they hadn't toppled an entire stand of trees. Balerion snorted, perhaps satisfied with the attempt at subtlety. John dismounted, his legs wobbling. The cold air smelled of pine and damp bark. Overhead, the sky was starting to gray again, threatening more snow. He surveyed the area, deciding that it was passable for a temporary hideout. Most travelers would likely avoid the deeper woods in winter. He stroked the dragon's neck, murmuring quiet thanks, though he had no illusions that Balerion understood his words. Still, the motion and tone seemed to soothe the beast. Now came the question of whether to venture to the nearest village on foot. He recalled glimpsing a cluster of huts, a short distance west of the bend in the river. It was an hour's journey at most if his sense of direction hadn't failed him in flight. John took stock of what he carried: his sword, his coin, a dagger, and meager supplies. He glanced at the dragon, uncertain how Balerion would react to being left alone. But the truth was, Balerion was as capable of surviving as any creature on Earth, and no man or beast would willingly tangle with it. He decided to try. Securing the cloak around himself, he started forward, placing a hand lightly on the dragon's shoulder. "I'll return," he said softly. Balerion flicked an ear-like membrane and shifted its wings. The notion of leaving something so powerful unsupervised was daunting, but there was little alternative. John took a few steps away, half expecting the dragon to follow. Instead, Balerion simply gazed at him with half-lidded eyes, then lay down amid the broken branches and debris, curling like a great cat. Smoke drifted from its nostrils. John set off, boots crunching in the snow. He kept an eye on the sky through the gaps in the canopy, noting the sun's position. He moved west, heading for that faint memory of a settlement. The forest was eerily silent except for the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or crow. The hush gave him too much space to think. Memories churned: Castle Black, Daenerys' final breath, the taste of her blood in the air when he'd driven the dagger into her heart. Ghosts, quiet loyalty. He forced himself to focus on the present. Nostalgia was a slippery path that led nowhere. Time passed slowly as he picked his way over uneven ground. The soil here was littered with pine needles frozen stiff, and here and there the snow crust was thick enough to hold his weight, but occasionally he punched through, sinking to his shins. At last, he saw a break in the tree line. The forest ended abruptly, giving way to a gentle slope of farmland. Fallow fields lay beneath a patchy blanket of snow. Darting rows of fence posts, sagging under ice, led toward a scattering of small huts and a larger building. Perhaps a barn or a warehouse. Smoke rose from several chimneys. A dirt track, rutted and half-frozen, cut across the farmland toward the horizon. John crouched at the forest's edge, taking in the scene. A handful of people moved among the huts, farmhands or peasants likely. They led a few gaunt horses, their breath misting in the chill. No banners were visible, no uniforms of knights or soldiers, suggesting it was not a major hold but rather a local hamlet. He studied the layout carefully. If he approached plainly, the small folk might panic. Yet if he attempted stealth, they might view him with suspicion. He sighed. He had no illusions that he still looked every bit the black-clad ranger, albeit with Targaryen blood. If they recognized him, or if they had heard any rumor that a monstrous dragon soared these skies, they might flee. Still, he was hungry, cold, and in need of any aid these villagers could spare. He decided to approach openly, but without aggression, leaving his sword sheathed. If they refused him, he would depart quietly. There was no point in forcing them to comply. He had not come here to terrorize innocents. Gathering his nerve, he descended the slope, boots sliding on the frosty grass. A crow cawed loudly, startled from a fence post, flapping away in a flurry of feathers. He passed the first few huts, hearing the muffled voices of families within, children's laughter turning to hushed murmurs. At the nearest doorway, an old woman with a heavily lined face stepped out, carrying a basket of what looked like kindling. She caught sight of John, froze, and let out a startled gasp. "Who goes there?" she called, voice quavering. "You're not from around here." The suspicion in her tone was plain. Strangers were seldom welcomed with warmth in hard times, and these were indeed hard times. John raised his hands, palms out, hoping to convey peaceful intent. "My name is John," he said. "I'm a traveler passing through. I'm in need of a little food if you can spare any. I have coin to pay." He tried to keep his voice steady, kind. She studied him with narrowed eyes. Another villager poked his head out from behind a corner, a pitchfork in hand, scowling. "Money?" the old woman echoed, as if trying to ascertain the deception. "We've scarce enough for ourselves, let alone feeding every wanderer." Her gaze fell to the sword at Joan's hip. She shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between him and the other villager with the pitchfork. "Where do you come from?" she demanded. John hesitated. "North," he answered, keeping it vague. It was true, just incomplete. "I have no quarrel with you or your people. It's just that winter roads are unforgiving, and I'm low on supplies." The second villager, a wiry man with a patchy beard, inched closer, still brandishing the pitchfork. "We heard rumors," he said, voice low, "that there's a dragon about. A black beast bigger than any man's seen. Could it be yours?" He spat the words as though half disbelieving his own question. Jean's mouth went dry. So the rumors had traveled faster than he expected. He tried to keep his expression neutral. "You heard that, did you?" he said quietly. "Such things get exaggerated." He didn't outright deny it, but he also didn't confirm. The man's eyes narrowed. Might be. But folks say it's big enough to blot out the sun." He glanced at the sky, as though expecting to see the beast even now. John lowered his gaze. "Whatever you've heard, I'm here alone," he said, at least half true. "I won't trouble you long, but I do need something to eat." He reached cautiously into his pouch, pulling out a couple of silver coins and holding them up so they could see. The old woman's eyes widened at the sight of silver. Real currency was valuable in a place like this. The tension in the air was as sharp as a drawn blade. For a moment, no one moved. Then a younger woman appeared from one of the huts, carrying a small child on her hip. She whispered something to the older woman, who nodded curtly. The pitchfork man grumbled under his breath, but lowered his weapon a fraction. "All right," the old woman said, voice guarded. "We might have a bit of bread and onions, perhaps some salted pork. But you'll not bring any trouble on our heads, or I'll have the men chase you off." She nodded to the patchy-bearded villager, who looked none too eager for a fight, but presumably would do his best if pressed. John inclined his head gratefully. "No trouble. You have my word." He held out the silver coins, waiting as the old woman's bony fingers clasped them. She inspected each carefully, biting them with her yellowed teeth. Then she clucked her tongue and muttered something to the younger woman. The settlement was small, only a handful of families, so their entire larder might be limited. Still, they returned after a few minutes with a small bundle. A chunk of coarse bread, a handful of onions, a bit of salted pork wrapped in rough cloth. John thanked them sincerely, stowing the food in his pouch. The old woman eyed him suspiciously, as though he might vanish into smoke at any moment. The man with the pitchfork spat again, but this time to the side, not in John's direction. "Where will you go now?" the younger woman asked. Her voice trembled slightly, curiosity mingling with fear. John considered the question. "South," he said after a moment. "Further along the Trident, perhaps." He offered no details. Perhaps it was better that they remain uncertain of his purpose, rather than tangling them up in talk of Targaryen blood and destiny. The old woman moved closer, lowering her voice so the child wouldn't hear. "If you run across bandits, best keep that steel ready. There've been more of them about, skulking near the main roads. They're hungry too. Desperate times." "Menol Jad." John nodded. "I appreciate the warning. He studied her worn features, the lines etched by countless winters. He wondered at the life she had led. She probably knew nothing of who he was, beyond the vague fear of a man who might be linked to the rumored dragon. "Thank you for the food," he said. She pursed her lips. "Coin is coin," she replied stiffly. Then, in a softer tone, "May the seven see you safe." John offered a final nod, turned, and made his way back up the slope toward the forest line. He felt their eyes on him every step of the way, tension coiling like a snake in his chest. He resisted the urge to look back, to confirm whether they still stared. It mattered little. He had what he came for. He disappeared into the tree line, weaving between pines and oaks, retracing his steps as best he could. The hush of the forest wrapped around him again, though this time he was more conscious of how exposed he was. The old woman's warning about bandits lingered. Even if he had no fear for himself, he couldn't risk being delayed or injured. Too many eyes waited on the horizon for him, or so it felt. The realm would not wait forever. Before long, he found the clearing where he'd left Balerion. Or rather, he found the wreckage of splintered branches and an upturned pine. His pulse spiked momentarily. Balerion was nowhere in sight. Alarmed, John pushed through the drifts, searching for sign of the dragon. A low growl from behind a thick grove of pines answered his unspoken fear. He jogged in that direction, relief flooding him at the sight of the dark, hulking shape. Balerion had moved deeper into the woods, perhaps in pursuit of something, or merely exploring. The dragon stood in a slightly larger clearing littered with the remains of what might have been a wild boar. Tufts of bristly hair lay scattered, and the snow was churned and stained with fresh blood. Balerion gnawed at a bloody chunk of meat. The scene vicious and strangely mundane. Steam rose from the carcass, ghost-like in the cold air. John approached carefully, not wanting to startle the beast. Balerion tore off a final ragged hunk of flesh, swallowing it with a wet gulp. When it noticed John's presence, the dragon exhaled loudly, half a hiss and half a grunt, as if to say, "I have fed. Now what of you?" John swallowed his revulsion at the gory sight, reminding himself that a dragon must hunt, same as any predator. "Good," he said softly, though the word felt feeble. "At least you won't be hungry enough to roast a village." He edged closer to Balerion's flank, letting the beast scent him. The dragon's jaws dripped with blood. Its eyes narrowed in satisfaction. If it worried about bandits or any other threat, it gave no sign. John stepped aside, finding a downed log to sit on, and rummaged in his pouch for the provisions he had bought. He tore off a piece of the coarse bread, ate it along with some onions, chewing slowly. The bread was stale and hard, but it tasted far better than the emptiness in his stomach. Now and then, he glanced up at Balerion, who paced with restless energy, occasionally lashing its tail against a tree trunk. The forest quieted again, as if every creature sensed the apex predator in their midst. Once his meager meal was done, John rose. He debated whether to press on immediately or allow himself a respite. The morning's flight had been long, and the day was still halfway to dusk. If he pushed further south now, they might reach the outskirts of more populous regions. But maybe that was exactly what he needed. Hiding in deserted watchtowers and half-frozen forests wouldn't solve anything. And yet each day he delayed, the rumor of his dragon soared ahead of him like a herald, sowing uncertainty. He considered Winterfell. The route there would take him back northwest, which felt counter to the direction of his internal compass. Something urged him south, closer to the seat of power. The memory of his dream haunted him. Balerion perched upon the Red Keep, the city trembling below. Whether it was a vision or mere fancy, he couldn't dismiss its hold on him. If he wanted answers, he might find them in King's Landing. Or at least he might confront the rightful king, his own brother, Bran. But a small voice told him he should see his sister Sansa first, that she could advise him. She was wise, had governed the north with a steady hand, and might offer counsel on whether the realm could bear another Targaryen claim. Yet the thought of returning to Winterfell with Balerion in tow sparked dread. The north had never seen a dragon perched on its ramparts, not since the brief Targaryen visit centuries ago. Would they greet him with horror? His mind churned, unable to settle. At last, he decided to keep heading south. He needed to see the shape of the realm under Bran's rule, to gauge the climate among the lords. He couldn't approach Sansa without understanding how best to protect her, and the north, from the blowback that might come if he traveled with Balerion. Having decided, Jon patted the beast's hide. "Come on," he said, mustering a steady voice. "Let's fly." He wiped a residual smear of blood from one of the dragon's scales with a handful of snow, though he couldn't clear it all. Balerion snorted, stepping away from the boar's carcass. Jon found a suitable ridge along the dragon's shoulder to haul himself up. This time, he held the bundle of leftover provisions in one hand, hooking his other arm around the spiny protrusion. Once settled, he tucked the bundle into the crook of his cloak, ready to hold tight for the flight. A single command was not needed. Balerion seemed to sense his intent. The dragon coiled its hind legs, then launched upward, smashing through a thin canopy of branches with a thunderous crash. Snow and pine needles showered down. Jon gritted his teeth, bracing himself against the jolt. When they cleared the treetops, the sunlight dazzled him. Below, the forest spread out in a patchwork of pale green and white. Ahead, the sky lay open. He directed the dragon roughly south, feeling the wind catch at his cloak, whipping it around like a banner. Their flight carried them across the farmland once more. Jon glimpsed the settlement he had just visited, small figures craning their necks toward the sky. He couldn't see their expressions from this height, but he imagined their shock at discovering the rumors were indeed true. A black dragon soared above them, the same wanderer who had asked for bread a short time before. No matter the caution, the story of this encounter would spread to every corner of the region. The hours slid by in the relentless wind. As they moved deeper into the riverlands, he spotted larger roads crisscrossing the landscape, traveled by wagons and the occasional mounted party. Smoke rose from the chimneys of more robust towns. They were still scattered, but some held wooden palisades or small stone walls for protection. The heart of the Riverlands had been the site of numerous battles during the War of the Five Kings. Jon remembered hearing tales of burned villages, pillaged farmland. It had been years, yet scars surely remained. He noticed that Balerion's flight path often drew curious stares from below, though no open hostility for now. Perhaps the creature's sheer size dissuaded any attempts at archery. Soon enough, the day began to wane. The sky took on a sullen hue of violet and gray, the air growing even colder. They needed a place to camp, ideally somewhere with enough concealment so as not to alarm a town. Jon scanned the terrain for a likely spot, eventually spotting a rocky outcrop along a winding stretch of the river. The area was dotted with boulders and brush, forming natural alcoves. He guided Balerion lower, and the dragon landed with a heavy thud amid scattered stones. Snow crunched beneath its claws, and an icy gust tousled Jon's hair as the wings folded. He dismounted carefully, leading Balerion toward a half-sheltered area near a fallen tree. From here, the dragon would have some cover from prying eyes, though not as much as he'd prefer. At least the vantage point offered a decent view of the surrounding area, so they could see if anyone approached. He retrieved some of the leftover bread and pork, forcing himself to eat despite his weariness. Each time the bitterness of salted meat touched his tongue, memories of the night's watch rations returned unbidden. It felt like a lifetime ago that he was Lord Commander, leading the fight against the dead. Now he served no banner but carried a power that could shatter armies. He found bits of kindling among the nearby brush and coaxed a small fire to life against the lee of a boulder, careful to keep it modest so it wouldn't shine too brightly. Balerion curled near the flames, half dozing, occasionally puffing out a hot breath that made the fire flicker wildly. Jon leaned against the dragon's flank, letting the creature's heat and the fire's glow push back the worst of the cold. Night deepened, the stars emerging fitfully through shifting clouds. A great silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant rush of water where the river cut through ice. As Jon's eyelids grew heavy, he drifted in and out of a fitful doze. He dreamed again. Or perhaps it was more than a dream. Images coalesced into a swirl of half-formed visions. He stood in the great hall of the Red Keep. The throne before him melted and twisted. Balerion's roar thundered in the distance. He smelled ash in the air, heard voices chanting words he couldn't discern. Then Daenerys appeared, her face sorrowful, whispering something about destiny. In the dream he reached out to touch her cheek, but she faded like mist. Next, he saw Sansa, solemn and regal in the hall, her hair bound in a northern style. She offered him a sad smile that broke his heart. Then Bran, blank-eyed, perched on the Iron Throne, though it was no longer shaped of swords, but of something intangible, shadow and memory. Jon felt a crushing sense of inevitability. He jolted awake to a faint hissing sound. Balerion stirred restlessly, the dragon's tail sweeping across the stones. The fire had dwindled to embers. Night stretched around them like an endless sea. Jon wiped the sweat from his brow, though the air was cold as ice. The dream clung to him like a ghost, refusing to let go. He rose, stirring the embers to coax a little more heat, then gazed across the dark expanse. The outlines of distant hills were barely visible, silent sentinels under the moonlight. Was he truly heading toward King's Landing, or was he simply running toward fate without a plan? He couldn't reconcile the swirling emotions inside, part dread, part longing to set things right, part bone-deep weariness of playing any role in the realm's destiny. Yet the dragon at his side was too great a force to ignore, and his blood, the Targaryen blood he never asked for, hummed with the memory of ancient kings. Through the rest of the night, he got only a handful of restless hours of sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, fragments of that dream teased him. By dawn, he woke feeling more exhausted than before, but also charged with a grim resolve. There would be no turning back. One did not ride the largest dragon in existence only to vanish into obscurity. Sooner or later, the realm would demand an answer for his presence. He set off again at first light, the sunrise painting the sky in streaks of pale orange and pink. Balerion's wings churned the crisp morning air as they ascended. The flight blurred into a cold, wind-lashed journey across the riverlands. Jon tried to pick out landmarks, small towns, old castles. Once, he glimpsed the ruin of Harrenhal on the horizon, its massive melted towers, a stark reminder of Dragonfire's legacy. He felt a twist of unease at the sight. Harrenhal had been brought to ruin by Balerion the Black Dread centuries ago, when Aegon the Conqueror had unleashed the flames. Now Jon rode what might be Balerion Reborn, casting a similar shadow across the land. Eventually, fatigue forced him to land again. The winter days were short, and he found a secluded spot in the shadow of a steep hill. Dusk settled fast, a veil of purple. Balerion hunted again, returning with the carcass of some large stag, devouring it in a gruesome display. Jon built another meager fire, sullen in the creeping cold. He wondered how long it would be until he encountered a real challenge, knights or soldiers loyal to the crown, or perhaps local lords alarmed by his presence. He had not flown unnoticed, that much was certain. Fear was a powerful motivator. Sooner or later, someone would gather enough men or weapons to try to slay the beast. That evening, he decided to push further, traveling a bit after sunset. The moonlight was bright enough to navigate by, and Balerion's eyes missed nothing in the darkness. They soared under a sky studded with stars, frost forming on Jon's cloak. His limbs felt numb. He pressed close to the dragon's warm hide, trying to stave off the worst of the chill. Flying by night felt both exhilarating and ominous. A silent pass over sleeping villages, a hush of wings that might haunt the nightmares of those who glanced up to see the outline of something colossal, blotting out the moon. Near midnight, he spied a larger settlement below, likely a town with a palisade. Torches burned along the perimeter, and a sizable structure stood at its center, perhaps a holdfast or a small keep. Reluctant to cause an uproar, Jon avoided descending too close. Instead, he circled, curious. From this vantage he could see movement near the gates, guards patrolling with lanterns. He heard faint horns, as if they had spotted the dragon or sensed it. He decided to leave them be. There was nothing to be gained from a nighttime confrontation. Time stretched, and he felt his eyelids droop from exhaustion. He needed to rest properly soon. Spotting a broad meadow by the river, he guided Balerion downward. The dragon's landing was gentler this time, stirring only a mild tremor in the earth. John dismounted, nearly collapsing as his legs wobbled. He unrolled his cloak on a patch of ground, somewhat sheltered by a low ridge. The stars overhead glittered fiercely, and the moon bathed the meadow in pale light. With shaky fingers, he pulled out the last of his bread, finishing it in a few bites. He wondered how he'd manage to gather further food if he kept avoiding human contact. The answer was that he couldn't. He'd need to make a plan, and soon. Perhaps if he found a minor lord or a knight sympathetic to the Targaryen cause, he could negotiate discreetly. But the realm didn't exactly harbor a large Targaryen faction these days. Most had accepted Bran's rule, or at least tolerated it. He sank onto his makeshift bed, letting the hush of the meadow envelop him. Balerion curled in the grass, exhaling a warm gust that made John's hair ruffle. A wry thought struck him. In times past, men built entire armies around a single dragon rider. Now it was only him, alone, with no retinue, no counsel. He had never felt more isolated. Sleep claimed him in waves, and the cold night passed without incident. At dawn he awoke to the shrill cry of a passing hawk, and the rustle of Balerion shifting in the tall grass. The memory of his dream still clung to him, though he couldn't remember the details this time. Only the heavy sense that something awaited him, that his approach to the throne was as inevitable as the sunrise. He rose stiffly, leaning against Balerion's side to steady himself. His breath plumed white in the chill air. Across the meadow, he spotted deer tracks, but no sign of the animals themselves. It occurred to him that in dire need, he might try to hunt, though he lacked a bow. He could set snares, but that would be time-consuming, and he had no illusions about his trapping skills. After some consideration, he realized how close he must be to the crossroads where travelers from the west, north, and south converged. If memory served, a decent-sized inn sat not far from that crossroad. A place he'd heard once referred to as the Crossroads Inn. In years past, travelers gathered there, exchanging news and bartering. If it still operated, he might be able to secure provisions or glean information about the current state of the realm. But going near an inn with a dragon was madness. Perhaps he could set Balerion to roost in a remote spot, then approach on foot. It was a risk. The more he thought about it, though, the more sense it made. Hiding away in the wilderness forever was no solution. He needed news. He needed a supply line. And above all, he needed to know what lay ahead if he continued south. Otherwise, he'd be flailing blindly, flying into whatever forces might be mustering. John scouted from the air briefly, identifying a rocky hollow along the banks of a nearby stream, shielded by steep sides and dense brush. It would be cramped for Balerion, but might offer partial concealment. He directed the dragon there. Balerion landed somewhat awkwardly, dislodging rocks that clattered into the water. The space was tight, but with some maneuvering, the dragon could coil within the hollow, effectively hidden from casual observers. Snow glistened on the rocks, and a few twisted trees grew along the bank. John dismounted, pressing a hand to Balerion's side. "Stay," he murmured, aware the command might mean little. The dragon blinked at him slowly. He repeated it, speaking in a calm, low voice, as though soothing a wild beast. He had no illusions that Balerion was tame, but perhaps the creature recognized him well enough to remain. If Balerion took flight while John was gone, it would signal his presence to everyone for miles around. Feeling the weight of uncertainty, John checked his sword and dagger, pulled his cloak tight, and started off on foot. The air bit at his cheeks, but he walked with measured resolve, forging a path through half-frozen undergrowth until he reached a muddy trail. Along that trail, he headed east, hoping to find the rumored crossroads. The distance wasn't too great. If memory served, he might arrive by midday if he kept a steady pace. As he walked, he kept a hand near his sword, mindful of bandits. The forest and fields around him were quiet, but not lifeless. He heard birds calling, and occasionally spied footprints of fox or deer in the snow. Once he saw a ragged shape dart between trees, though whether it was an animal or a man, he couldn't be certain. He pressed onward, scanning his surroundings. In the distance, he glimpsed smoke rising, a sign of habitation. Sure enough, by late morning, he came upon a broader road. The muddied ruts were frozen, making for treacherous footing, but it was clearly well used. Not far beyond, the trees gave way to open farmland, and there, at a fork in the road, stood an inn of weathered timbers and a stout roof. A sign hung outside, though from this distance, John couldn't make out the faded paint. A couple of wagons were drawn up near the entrance, and a small group of travelers huddled around a stable boy who was tending to horses. John paused. His heart thudded with an odd mix of anticipation and trepidation. He hadn't walked into a public place in a long time, not since his exile. He was no longer wearing the stark black of the Night's Watch, but his gear was worn and his face was not so easily forgotten by those who knew him. Still, out here in the Riverlands, perhaps few recognized him. If word of the Black Dragon had run faster than he anticipated, though, there might already be watchers. He steadied himself and pressed forward, adopting a posture of weary anonymity. With any luck, no one would look too closely at a lone traveler seeking shelter and a meal. The thick smell of smoke and cooking onions wafted from the inn's doorway, and he felt his stomach tighten with hunger. A signboard swung on creaking hinges, showing a faded image that might once have been a crossing of roads. This was indeed the Crossroads Inn, or so it seemed. A stable hand looked up as John approached, but quickly glanced away, uninterested, returning to the horse he was brushing. Another traveler, a grizzled man in a cloak of patched fur, gave John a cursory nod before entering the inn. John's breath condensed in the chill air as he stepped onto the threshold. His heart pounded. He reached for the door's iron latch and pushed inside. Warmth enveloped him at once. A hearty fire crackled in a large hearth, and the murmur of conversation filled the common room. Tables and benches were scattered about, occupied by travelers of various sorts, merchants, a pair of what looked like local guards, and a few others. John slipped his hood lower, hiding some of his features. He moved toward a corner table near the fireplace, taking care not to draw attention. The innkeeper, a stout man with graying hair, bustled about, ladling stew into bowls and serving tankards of ale. The air was thick with the scents of roasting meat, onions, and stale drink. John felt his mouth water. It had been so long since he'd had a proper hot meal. He waited until the innkeeper passed near, then quietly asked for stew, bread, and ale if it was available. The man assessed him quickly, noting the worn cloak and sword at his hip. John fished out a silver coin, which made the innkeeper's eyes gleam with interest. "Right away, sir," the man said, his tone more welcoming now that he saw a coin. John settled on the bench, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones. He kept his hood up, gaze drifting over the other patrons. Most seemed preoccupied with their own worries, exchanging gossip about local troubles, complaining about taxes, discussing the snows. Yet, overhearing tidbits of conversation might prove useful. He listened with half an ear. "Bandits near the old mill," one merchant was saying to another. "Lost a good horse, I did. They're bold as you please, taking advantage of the winter." Another voice chimed in. "Heard a rumor that some monstrous dragon was seen up near the Trident. Could be the start of new wars. The realm don't need that sort of trouble again." The speaker was a woman in a hooded cloak, her tone hushed yet urgent. Her companion, a man with a bushy beard, scoffed. "Dragon? That's all talk. If there was a dragon, we'd have seen an army by now. It's some tall tale spread by thieves to scare folks." Yet John saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The innkeeper soon returned, setting down a steaming bowl of stew, a chunk of bread, and a foaming tankard of ale. "Anything else, sir?" he asked, eyeing John curiously. John shook his head. "This is plenty," he murmured, offering a small nod of thanks. He wrapped his hands around the warm bowl, letting the heat radiate through him. The smell was divine compared to the meager fare he'd endured. Slowly, he lifted the spoon and tasted the stew. It was rich with meat, carrots, onions, and herbs. The flavor was a welcome assault on his starved senses. He forced himself not to gulp it down too quickly, mindful that drawing attention would do him no favors. Conversation ebbed and flowed around him. He caught snatches of talk about local disputes, a harvest festival postponed due to the cold, a minor lord rumored to be mustering men to chase out bandits. No one seemed certain of the crown's stance on anything. Bran's rule was distant, intangible, administered largely by local lords. The name Targaryen was spoken only in hushed mentions of the rumors. Some travelers dismissed it as nonsense. Others took it seriously, speculating about the chaos it might unleash if the Mad Queen's allies were somehow returning. More than once, Jon heard Daenerys' name spat like a curse. Each time, a pang of sorrow cut through him, but he kept silent. When he finished the stew, he sopped up the last bits with bread, savoring every crumb. Then he drained the ale in a few deep swallows, feeling a flush of warmth spread through his chest. He considered paying for a room, but decided against it. He couldn't be away from Balerion for too long, lest the dragon grow restless or wander. He also risked someone recognizing him if he lingered. Already, the innkeeper eyed him with mild curiosity, as though sensing something familiar. Jon rose, dropping another coin on the table for the meal. Before he left, though, he approached the hearth under the pretense of warming his hands, drifting close to the pair discussing the dragon rumor. "You say folk have seen this dragon near the Trident?" Jon said lightly, pitching his voice low. "How far from here was that?" The woman turned, lowering her hood. She was middle-aged, face lined from years on the road. Word is it flew overhead not 2 days past, heading south. Some say it's as large as Balerion the Black Dread, if you believe old tales. Her eyes darted over Jon's hooded face. "Why? You planning on chasing after it?" Jon shrugged. "Only curious. Dragons aren't common sights." He tried to keep the tremor from his voice. The bearded man snorted. "I'll believe it when I see it. But if it's real, the realm best brace itself. Nothing good ever came of dragons in Westeros, not since the conquest." Jon nodded thoughtfully, then offered a polite half-smile and backed away. He sensed no immediate danger from these two. Only typical traveler gossip. Still, it reminded him that soon, there would be more official notice. Lords would send scouts or ravens. If he continued south, he might face entire companies of men alerted to his approach. He made his way toward the door, shoulders hunched as he slipped outside. A blast of cold air hit him, making him realize how warm the inn had been. He glanced around the small yard. A few travelers were tending horses, some exchanging pleasantries in the stable yard. No one gave him more than a cursory glance. He started down the road, hoping to vanish into the winter landscape before curiosity followed him. His mind churned as he walked. The talk in the inn confirmed that the rumor spread quickly indeed. If he pushed further south, he might soon reach areas with heavier patrols. Or he could angle southeast, perhaps making for the Vale, or even heading toward the Blackwater Rush. But the truth remained. No matter which path he took, the realm was stirring in response to the Black Dragon's flight. He felt the weight of every wing beat behind him, each one echoing across the land like a clarion call. Once out of sight of the inn, he veered off the main road, cutting through a narrow stand of trees. The snow crunched underfoot. He scanned the sky for signs of ravens, but all he saw was a single hawk circling lazily overhead. The day was clear, sunlight glinting off the frosted branches. It lent the world a fragile beauty, but Jon's thoughts were anything but tranquil. Time was slipping away, and with each passing hour, the possibility of a peaceful resolution grew slimmer. At last, he drew near the rocky hollow where he'd hidden Balerion. Relief washed over him at the sight of the dragon's black scales among the stones. Balerion shifted, a small growl rumbling in its throat as Jon approached. The beast's eyes glowed in the winter light, its tail swishing in lazy arcs that scoured lines in the snow. It was a predator, unchallenged in this land, and yet it waited for him. Perhaps this truly was his fate, to guide this ancient power through a realm unprepared for it. He clambered down the rocky slope, boots slipping on the icy surface. At the bottom, the dragon rose, looming over him with an almost inquisitive tilt to its massive head. Jon reached out, letting his hand rest against a patch of scales. Balerion blinked slowly, exhaling a wave of hot breath. Despite the fearsome exterior, Jon felt a flicker of something like gratitude. For now they were together, forging a bond that could reshape kingdoms, or shatter them. He thought of the roads ahead. He could travel swiftly, across fields and rivers, possibly bypassing entire armies if he flew high. But eventually, if he meant to reach King's Landing, he'd have to face the reality of passing over well-guarded regions. And if he arrived at the capital with a dragon at his side, how would they receive him? Would Bran see him as a threat, or as a brother returning home with a monstrous blessing? Tyrion might counsel caution, but then again, Tyrion's loyalties had always been complex. Jon's chest felt tight. The realm was not a puzzle with an easy solution. Daenerys had tried to bend it to her will, claiming it was her birthright, and the cost had been unspeakable. Now with Balerion's might at his back, Jon feared repeating the same mistakes, or stumbling into a new tragedy. Yet, the wheels of fate turned inexorably. He took a deep breath, stroking the dragon's neck in a slow, steady motion. "All right," he said, voice hushed in the winter stillness. "We move on. Not sure exactly where or how, but we move on." Balerion rumbled, almost in agreement, and spread its wings slightly, dislodging clumps of snow that tumbled down the rocks. Jon clung to that meager resolve. Step by step, wingbeat by wingbeat, he would find his path. He would try to protect the innocent from the terror of another Targaryen conquest. But if war came despite his intentions, he would face it with whatever strength he possessed. He was Jon Snow, once a bastard, once king in the north, now a reluctant dragonlord. For better or worse, the realm would reckon with him soon enough. With that, he began to climb onto Balerion's back, bracing himself for another day's flight. The sun was still high enough to press south a few more hours. Gathering what little courage he had left, he drew in a breath and nodded. The dragon launched skyward in a rush of power. The wind whipped past Jon's face, and he held tight, scanning the horizon for the next step of an odyssey that felt as though it would decide the fate of Westeros itself. Jon guided Balerion higher into the cold morning sky, scanning the rolling farmland and barren trees below. The winter sun was still pale, only just cresting the horizon. Each wing beat carried them southward, away from the crossroads and the modest inn where he had secured a hot meal the day before. Snow swirled around them in tiny whorls, scattered by the dragon's passage. The air bit at Jon's cheeks, though he felt the faint warmth radiating from Balerion's scales where his knees pressed tight. He'd flown for an hour or more when he glimpsed a wide plain to the southwest, pale and half-blanketed by fresh snow. Patches of brown earth peeked through, a sign that winter's clutch here wasn't as fierce as in the north. At this distance, the open plain looked desolate, but Jon's keen gaze picked out the faint geometry of roads crossing toward a cluster of buildings. A moderate town, perhaps, though not one large enough to rival a city. As he pondered whether to press on or find a place to rest Balerion, the dragon tilted slightly, ignoring Jon's subtle leanings and responding instead to something else. A strong scent, or maybe a distant movement, that piqued its predatory instinct. They glided closer, the wind a hollow roar in Jon's ears. Soon he could make out a traveling caravan strung along a road, wagon after wagon, half a dozen or more, with outriders on horseback. Their progress was slow, the horses plodding through the half-frozen mud. The wagons looked laden, possibly with trade goods or winter stores. At the sight of the great black silhouette overhead, the outriders began to panic. He saw them spur their mounts, forming a loose perimeter around the wagons. A few pointed upward, shouting. From this height, Jon couldn't hear their words, but he guessed they must be cries of alarm. The last thing he wanted was to cause another stir among travelers. Yet Balerion circled slowly, as if drawn to the movement. An instinct to hunt, or maybe just to investigate. Jon tightened his grip on the dragon's neck spines, calling out in a low voice, "Easy." It rarely made a difference, but he tried nonetheless. The caravan halted below, forming a disorganized cluster of wagons. No one fired arrows. They likely had few bows, if any. Still, tension rippled through them. A single dragon, especially one so large, could wipe them out if it chose. Jon urged Balerion to climb to keep distance. The dragon hesitated, wings beating in slow, powerful strokes. Then, either by Jon's subtle commands or by its own passing whim, it banked away from the caravan. The travelers remained in a tight formation, no doubt watching with wide eyes, waiting to see if the black beast would wheel back to attack. But Balerion soared onward, heading farther south across fields and low hills. The cold air stung John's lungs. He realized with a jolt that his own hunger still gnawed at him, and the last of his provisions had been eaten the previous night. The stew at the inn was no more than a memory. Another day, maybe two, and he would be forced to land again near civilization in search of supplies. He wanted to avoid more frightened crowds, but the realm offered few empty spaces to linger. Even farmland had watchers, farmers or travelers. Each new sighting of the black dragon was another rumor flung across the countryside, gathering speed like a rolling avalanche. By midday, the sun climbed higher, washing the land in a brittle light that did little to warm him. John saw a winding river below. Thin sheets of ice clung to its edges, but in the center, the water flowed free. Balerion descended without prompting, perhaps sensing fresh prey to slake its boundless hunger. Indeed, as they neared the riverbank, John glimpsed movement. A small herd of deer searching for water where the ice had broken. The dragon's body tensed, the muscles beneath the scales shifting. John braced himself. In a sudden dive, Balerion folded its wings. The world lurched, a rush of wind, smothering John's shout. The deer looked up too late. With frightening speed, the dragon bore down on them. Flames spewed from its maw, turning the air into a furnace that blasted the riverbank. Steam erupted from the river's surface. The deer scattered in blind terror. One was instantly caught in the inferno, reduced to a blackened husk before it even hit the ground. Another leapt into the water, but it stood no chance. Balerion landed heavily, snapping up what remained of the first deer in its colossal jaws. The others darted away, bounding through the brush, fleeing for their lives. John watched the brutal efficiency with the hollow acceptance he'd developed over these last days. This was nature, the primal truth of a dragon unleashed. He slid off Balerion's shoulder, giving the beast room to feed. The intense heat radiated from the scorched earth, mingling with the lingering stench of charred flesh. He turned away, exhaling slowly, trying to quell the sick feeling in his stomach. At least it would keep Balerion sated for a while, reducing the likelihood of it attacking human settlements. He moved a short distance up the riverbank, searching for a spot sheltered from the worst of the wind. A stand of willows drooped over the water, their branches laced with frost. Broken reeds crunched underfoot as he found a patch of open ground. Crouching there, he scooped water into his hands to drink. It was painfully cold, but fresh enough to clear some of the dryness from his throat. Behind him, Balerion crunched bones with wet snaps that echoed across the quiet bank. After drinking his fill, John washed the grime from his face, ignoring the icy sting. He felt unsettled, as he always did after witnessing Balerion's savage hunts, but necessity kept him tethered to the dragon's side. A scuff of movement drew his attention. He turned, half expecting to see an animal. Instead, he spotted a man's figure at the crest of the next rise, perhaps 24 paces away, partially hidden by a cluster of bushes. The figure froze the instant John looked up. John's pulse leapt. He straightened, hand drifting to Longclaw's pommel. The man stood stock still, as if trying to decide whether to run or remain. He wore ragged leathers, a short cloak, and carried a bow with an arrow nocked. His face was obscured by a thick hood, but John sensed the tension. Possibly a hunter, or a bandit. Possibly someone who'd tracked the deer. The question now was whether he intended to shoot at Balerion or at John himself. John raised his hands slowly, palms open. He tried to speak calmly, though his voice still carried the weight of caution. "I've no quarrel with you," he said, letting the wind carry his words. "Nor does the dragon, if you mean no harm." Balerion was still ripping into the deer carcass behind him, oblivious or indifferent to this new arrival. The man hesitated, lowering the bow a fraction but not fully. John saw fear in the tilt of his shoulders. Few men could remain entirely composed with a legendary beast, devouring prey a stone's throw away. The man spoke at last, voice trembling. "I saw the flames. Thought maybe. I don't know what I thought." John kept his stance neutral, aware that any sudden move might spook the stranger into loosing an arrow, or fleeing, which could also bring trouble if he spread tales of a dragon rider so close. I'm only passing through, John said. The deer was for the dragon. The hooded figure let out a ragged breath, then slowly uncocked the bow. I've heard whispers all through the Riverlands about a black dragon. Didn't expect to see it with my own eyes. 7 saved me. He eyed the enormous silhouette behind John, where Balerion's tail thrashed, flattening reeds. They say the rider's a Targaryen. That true? John hesitated. Denials would do little now. This man had likely been hearing the same rumors as everyone else. I'm John, he said finally, not quite answering. He watched the stranger's expression carefully, though he saw only wide-eyed anxiety. You, the man swallowed. You're not here to burn out the countryside, are you? His voice held a tremor. I've had enough war in my time. John shook his head. I don't want war. I'm not here to slaughter innocents. The dragon hunts. Yes, but I aim to keep that hunger from turning on people. He felt the bitter irony of it. Many still recalled the horrors inflicted by dragons under the Targaryen banner, from Aegon's conquest to the sack of King's Landing in recent memory. Even if Joan's aims were peaceful, fear often spoke louder than facts. The man seemed to weigh Joan's words. At length he lowered the bow properly, though he kept the arrow in his grip. My name's Will. His gaze flicked between John and the monstrous shape of Balerion. I'm a huntsman, or I was, before bandits forced me out of my old range. Been wandering trying to find a place safe from all this talk of war. John nodded. I know how that feels. He edged away from the water, stepping a few paces closer to Will, ensuring his hands were visible and unthreatening. The bandits are that bad around here? Will snorted. Worse than I've seen in years. They're on every road, every wood. The local lords don't have the men to chase them all away, or maybe they don't care enough. We hear King Bran sits the Iron Throne, sending out messages about peace. But I've yet to see that peace. Me sent her. John sensed the bitterness in the huntsman's tone. He couldn't blame him. This was the harsh reality of a kingdom still recovering from conflicts. Where do you travel now? John asked, partly to keep the man talking, partly out of genuine curiosity. Will shrugged. South, maybe. Some say it's safer near the Crownlands. Others say it's full of soldiers, so if you're not part of a lord's retinue, you'd best keep moving. Hard to find a good haven these days. He exhaled, glancing at Balerion again. The dragon's meal was nearly finished, the carcass stripped of much of its flesh. Gods, I never thought I'd stand this close to a dragon and live. You're not in danger, John reassured him. Not unless you threaten us. He paused, considering what to do next. Having the huntsman slip away could lead to more rumors, but that was inevitable. John wasn't about to start spilling blood just to keep secrets. Instead, he tried a different angle. How far is it to Harrenhal from here? Or do you know these lands better westward? Will grimaced. Harrenhal's not far to the west, maybe 2 days on foot, but that place is cursed. I'd steer clear if I were you, and I doubt your dragon can roost comfortably in those ruins without stirring the ghosts. Despite himself, he let out a nervous chuckle, as if the notion was too absurd to dismiss. South will take you toward the Blackwater. If you keep flying, you'll see the forests and farmland around the capital soon enough. John weighed his options. Harrenhal was a grim place, infamous for its melted towers and ill luck. It might offer temporary shelter, but it was far from hidden. Anyone who spotted Balerion perched among those blackened spires would talk for generations. Then again, continuing south at this pace would lead him to the Crownlands soon, where roads were thick with people, and any approach to King's Landing would be more difficult to manage discreetly. He looked back at Will. Have you heard any word about a muster of soldiers between here and the Crownlands? Anyone forming up to deal with the dragon threat? No. Not sure, Will admitted. I heard talk of a few knights gathering at various keeps, wanting to protect their lands or gain the favor of King Bran. Some say ravens have flown from the capital, warning lords to watch the skies for a black-winged beast. That's to be you, I suppose. John couldn't help a small, rueful smile. Aye. Well, I'm just one man, though I doubt that'll stop them from trying something foolish. He glanced at Balerion again, who now stood by the water's edge, gulping the last pieces of charred venison with a slow, deliberate crunch. "I won't keep you, Will. Go your way in peace." The huntsman hesitated, seeming torn between curiosity and fear. Finally, he bobbed his head in a small bow. "And you," he said, voice subdued. He stepped back, then turned. The brush rustled as he headed up the rise. A moment later he was gone, leaving only the hush of the wind over the river. John stood there, letting his breath cloud the air. That had gone as well as he could have hoped. No violence, no raised alarm. But the huntsman would almost certainly speak of this encounter, spreading more accurate tales of the Black Dragon rider, a man named John, who claimed not to seek war. Whether anyone believed that part was another matter. He turned back to Balerion, who stretched its wings, scattering droplets of water. The dragon eyed him, as though impatient. "Shall we continue then?" John said, quietly mocking himself. Balerion huffed, a rumble reverberating in its chest. John gripped a scaly ridge and pulled himself up, wincing at the aches in his muscles. He settled astride, carefully adjusting his cloak to block some of the cold wind. At his silent urging, Balerion launched skyward. The rush of ascent still made John's heart hammer every time. Snow flurries whirled around them. He could see the churned riverbank below, the blackened patch where flames had seared the ground. Far in the distance, the huntsman was only a speck, trudging off. Then the sky consumed all else, and the land became a tapestry of white and brown stretching endlessly. They flew for what felt like hours, each moment a blend of wonder and dread. Joan's thoughts churned. He recalled the huntsman's mention of ravens from the capital, alerting lords to the presence of a black dragon. It meant the crown was taking steps. Whether defensive, offensive, or merely cautious was unclear. If Bran's hand still guided the realm, how would he react to the rumored return of a Targaryen rider? John tried to picture his brother's impassive face, the unnerving quiet of his gaze. Did Bran anticipate Joan's arrival? Did he want it? So many questions. He could only keep moving forward. Afternoon, shadows lengthened across the fields below. Sparse groves of leafless trees dotted the landscape, but overall, the terrain here was more open than the thick forests of the north. They passed over farmland, a patchwork of dormant fields. Often John spotted groups of peasants raising their heads, then scattering like startled birds. He tried to keep high enough not to incite panic, but Balerion occasionally descended, presumably to investigate. Each time, John had to coax the dragon back upward, not wanting to spark more terror than necessary. By now, farmers throughout the region would tell tales of the monstrous silhouette overhead, shimmering black in the winter sun. As dusk crept in, John realized they needed shelter again. The wind carried a biting chill, and he felt numb in his extremities, despite being pressed close to Balerion's heated scales. He scanned the horizon, searching for any feature that might provide cover. In the distance, a low ridge rose from the plains. Beyond it, a scattering of bare trees dotted a slope that fell toward a shallow valley. A stream or small river glinted at the bottom, mostly frozen. He steered Balerion in that direction. When they landed, the dragon's claws tore into the slope, sending clods of snow tumbling. John dismounted, nearly stumbling as his boots touched the ground. The cold was fierce, and his joints ached from hours of clinging to dragonback. He exhaled a tremulous breath, scanning their surroundings. The ridge cut off some of the wind, and the cluster of trees might hide them from casual view if travelers stuck to the main roads. He spotted the old remains of a stone structure, perhaps an abandoned shepherd's hut or a small shrine, collapsed with age. At least it was something. He coaxed Balerion to settle near the half-fallen stones. The dragon's bulk radiated warmth in the gathering twilight. Here, the snow lay in thick drifts. John had to wade through it to reach what might have been a doorway. The structure had only a few walls still standing, but it offered a partial windbreak. He brushed away loose rubble and fallen branches, making enough space to sit. With numb fingers, he gathered what scattered sticks and twigs he could find beneath the snow, forming a small pile. Producing flint, he painstakingly sparked a small fire to life. the warmth slow to build, but welcome all the same. A hush fell over the valley as darkness deepened. Balerion prowled, then settled down with a groan, curling its tail around the broken stones. The dragon's eyes glowed with faint red embers, reflecting the meager flames of Joan's fire. Jon himself huddled close to that flickering heat, wishing he had a heavier cloak or more supplies. Hunger gnawed at him again, but he had nothing left to eat. He debated hunting in the last light of day, but the effort might be futile without a bow. And Balerion had already gorged on deer. He doubted the dragon would deign to chase small game. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the wind lull him into a light doze. Sleep was too easy to slip into, even if it came in restless fits. In his half-slumber, he dreamed again of the Iron Throne, seeing it not as a seat of metal, but as a looming shape cast in black shadow. He heard the roar of a dragon echo through a great hall, then the voices of people chanting. Though he couldn't make out the words, he felt Daenerys' presence behind him, intangible but undeniable, and the guilt that followed seared him as sharply as any dragonfire. He wanted to turn and see her face, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but the dream scattered, and he woke with a start. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the crumbled walls. Outside, the moon hung high, illuminating the ridge with silver light. Balerion seemed half asleep, breathing in deep, rhythmic rumbles. Jon sighed and added another few sticks to the embers, stirring them to life. His limbs ached, his mind churned. The old question surfaced again. Why had fate placed him here? Why give him another dragon, the greatest of all, after everything? He had no answer. He only knew that the realm was awake to his presence. The next steps loomed: winter villages, outposts, and eventually the edges of the Crownlands, with their better guarded roads and watchtowers. If the huntsman had heard talk of ravens from King's Landing, then those watchtowers would be on alert for a black dragon overhead. Could he hope to bypass them, landing unseen? Possibly, but not indefinitely. At some point, he would need to reveal himself, whether to parley or to demand an audience. A battle seemed inevitable in the eyes of the lords, but perhaps he could prevent it by showing that he did not come to conquer or burn. He mulled each possibility as the moon drifted across the sky, until exhaustion finally pulled him under again. He woke to the pale light of dawn, his breath stirring mist in the frigid air. The remains of the fire were a few smoldering coals. Balerion had risen and prowled a short distance away, investigating the slope that led to the frozen creek. The dragon cracked the thin ice with a single stomp, then drank from the water beneath. Jon gathered his cloak around him, stamping his feet to return feeling to his toes. As usual, his stomach felt hollow, and he wondered if he could pass near a small hamlet soon to buy or beg a little food. His coin purse was still weighted with some silver, but silver meant nothing if no one was willing to trade once they recognized him as the rumored Targaryen rider. He decided to move quickly, hoping that with another day's flight, he might reach a region closer to the Roserad or King's Road, where caravans and travelers abounded. Some might flee, but others might be too desperate to turn down coin, even from a Targaryen with a dragon. If he could avoid harming anyone, perhaps word would spread that he was not the second coming of a mad queen, but a different sort of presence. It was a faint hope, but better than none. Mounting Balerion once more, Jon steeled himself against the inevitable rush of frigid air. The dragon leapt from the ridge, scattering loose stones and snow, wings snapping open to catch the wind. They soared southward again, the morning sky bright but wintry. Clouds massed in the east, threatening a midday storm. Jon guided Balerion to skirt around any clusters of habitations they passed, though it wasn't always possible. From his vantage, the region was more populated than the northern riverlands, with more roads, farmsteads, and villages set amid the rolling hills. It wasn't long before the weather turned. A slate-gray front of clouds drifted in, bringing swirling snow that stung Jon's face and reduced visibility. Balerion snorted in irritation, flapping harder against sudden gusts. The land below blurred under a veil of white, and Jon struggled to pinpoint landmarks. He realized with a pang that if the storm worsened, they might be forced to land wherever they could find partial shelter, even if it was near farmland. The snowfall thickened, and the wind howled. Jon's cloak whipped around him, edges snapping painfully against his calves. His cheeks felt raw, Balerion roared, fighting the gale's push. For a moment, it seemed the dragon might attempt to rise above the cloud layer, but that carried its own risks. Flying blind high up could lead them far off course or into dangerous airs. John patted the dragon's neck as if to calm it, though he wasn't sure Balerion cared. Eventually, Balerion angled downward, guided perhaps by an instinct for safer ground or because John shifted his weight that way. Through the swirling snow, John caught glimpses of a small wood near a broad stream. Dark shapes of pine and oak formed a ragged boundary against the drifts. It was as good a place as any to hunker down until the storm eased. He braced himself as Balerion dropped heavily into the tree line, crushing a few smaller trunks. Snow cascaded in powdery billows, and branches cracked in protest. John coughed, momentarily blinded by the swirl of white. When it cleared, he saw that Balerion had found a slight hollow under a few ancient pines. Though the fit was tight, it offered some natural barricade against the wind. Snow still fell heavily around them, but not with the same fury as in the open. The dragon folded its wings, sniffing the air. John dismounted, nearly collapsing from the combined exhaustion and sudden jolt. His legs tingled, and he pressed a hand to a pine trunk for support. The day had turned dark, as if twilight were falling early. Snow piled quickly, already halfway up John's shins as he trudged around the small clearing. Balerion exhaled a blast of hot breath, melting some of the nearby drifts. He found a large pine with a thick trunk and tried to clear enough space beneath its drooping boughs to form a crude shelter. Needles pricked at his hands, but he managed to scoop aside the snow. The hollow ground beneath the tree was slightly drier, thick with fallen needles. He settled there, curling into his cloak, breath rasping in the hush of swirling snow. The storm raged for what felt like hours. Gusts of wind rattled the branches, sending more cascades of snow down, half burying John's improvised shelter at times. He would shake himself free, push the snow away, and cower back under the pine. Balerion rumbled and shifted, occasionally unleashing a gout of flame that hissed and crackled against the snow-covered ground, creating pockets of slushy mud. The heat radiating from the dragon's body kept the immediate clearing from turning into a frozen tomb, but the storm was relentless. John's stomach cramped painfully. Hunger had sharpened to an ache that left him dizzy. He considered venturing out to see if he could find rabbits or other small game, but the raging snow made that a dangerous gamble. He'd be half blind, stumbling through drifts, and if he slipped into a concealed ravine or wandered too far, it could be the end of him. He was forced to wait, simmering in frustration, every muscle tense. At least the swirling snow likely deterred any watchers from stumbling upon them. For once, Balerion's location might remain unreported. Night fell. John had no proper fire to keep warm, only the distant glow of Balerion's body heat. Now and then, the dragon breathed a plume of flame into the sky, seemingly annoyed by the claustrophobic confinement and the pelting flakes. Steam rose from its scales, which melted the snow on contact. John dozed fitfully, waking each time the wind shifted. Eventually, well past midnight by his guess, the storm's fury began to abate. The wind dropped to a low moan, and the snow slackened to a gentle fall. John stood gingerly, easing the stiffness from his joints. Everything was still shrouded in darkness, but at least he could see the outlines of tree trunks and the slope beyond. He pressed a hand to Balerion's flank, inhaling the sulfur-tinged warmth. If not for the dragon, he might have frozen to death in the open. The beast turned its massive head, regarding him with a glowing eye. John murmured softly, "When dawn breaks, we'll try to find food. Can't survive on air." The dragon snorted, more or less ignoring him. In the faint moonlight that filtered through thinning clouds, John moved to the edge of the clearing. The drifts here were waist-high in places, pristine and undisturbed, except for where Balerion's thrashing tail had carved deep furrows. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but calmer now. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon, turning the forest into a landscape of silvery shadows. He thought of the huntsman Will again, of the caravan travelers, of the old woman at that remote hamlet who had sold him bread. Ordinary people, trying to survive a winter that was harsh even in these southern parts. They had little enough to spare, yet he would have to rely on them, or others like them, to sustain himself. or else starve. That realization weighed heavily on him. He recalled how Daenerys had once spoken of breaking the wheel, freeing people from tyranny. Yet in the end, she'd brought only fire and blood to King's Landing. Jon was determined not to repeat that fate, but how could he truly prove himself different? Before dawn, he caught a few more snatches of restless sleep. When the first pale glow tinted the horizon, he stirred, bones aching. The storm had passed. A crisp, quiet morning greeted him. Snow coated every branch, and